that every accident he was ever in was because Rita was praying a rosary. And so my guess is that around 6 p.m. today, Rita was praying a rosary because I was in an accident on the way here. So, just to keep that tradition going. Good evening and welcome on behalf of Crossroads Cultural Center. A peculiar characteristic of modern culture is that many important questions, and especially religious questions, are seldom phrased in terms of true or false. We seem to think that it is much more important to determine whether something is new or old, progressive or conservative, relevant or irrelevant, in fashion or out of fashion, socially acceptable or socially unacceptable. For this reason, it is surprising and refreshing when somebody stands up and asks the simple question, is this true or not? To do so requires a certain kind of courage, or more precisely, a certain kind of morality. Monsignor Giussani used to like to say that to talk about the morality of knowledge in the sense that the problem of human knowledge does not lie in a particular intellectual capacity, but rather that the center of the problem is really a proper position of the heart, a correct attitude, a feeling in its place, a morality. One must love the truth of an object more than your attachment to the opinions you have already formed about it. More concisely, one could say, love the truth more than yourself. Giussani was writing before the advent of the internet, which is the most powerful instrument ever invented to encourage people to love their own opinions more than anything else, and certainly more than the truth. But still, from time to time, some people show up who have the simplicity of heart, what the gospel calls poverty of spirit, to ask, is it true or not? This is even more exceptional in reference to the most tremendous question that humans have to face, which is the one that Christ asked. Whom do you say that I am? Which means, am I true or not? Over the last few years, many of us have come to recognize one such person in our friend, Leah Libresco. And thus we have decided to invite her to have a conversation precisely on this topic. In the words of Dostoevsky, can a cultured man or woman, a European or an American of our day really believe in the divinity of Christ, the Son of God? Before starting, here are just some few biographical facts about Leah. Leah graduated from Yale in 2011, and she lives in Washington, D.C. She works as a news writer for 538 by day, and by night writes many blog posts for Patheos about theology, philosophy, and even math. She was received into the Catholic Church in November 2012, and you can continue to follow her at Unequally Yoked on Patheos. So, without further ado, we welcome you, Leah Libresco. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for inviting me here tonight. And what I'd like to do is kind of tell you the story of my conversion along two parallel tracks. Because this is really a question of, how do we explore, or how did I explore and seek the truth? And I'd like to tell you kind of along the personal track of the actual questions I was asking and the answers I found. But I'd like to kind of tell you the broader story of what my friends did and the Christians in my life did as evangelists and witnesses, and how that shaped the way I was asking these questions. Because my personal conversion story is very important to me. But I will warn you that if you brought an atheist friend to the talk tonight in the hopes of turning to them at the end and going, well, you may be disappointed. I came into the church because I was asking him a very particular set of questions about morality, about how it is we come to know it. And where I kind of find myself is often in the position of someone who's climbed a mountain. I kept pursuing truth, I followed where it led, and I found myself at Catholicism, the highest, truest point I could find. But I only know the path I followed to get up there, the path from Neoplatonist deontology to Catholicism. And when I meet friends who are kind of radical existentialists, I can tell them that I'm pretty sure Catholicism is true. And that means that I expect there's a path from where they are to where I am, but it's not the one I followed, so I don't have kind of a step-by-step proof from existentialism to Catholicism. But I would like to tell you about my story and about the ways that my friends shaped my story and shaped my life. So to begin with, the most important part of my conversion, I think any conversion, is having a reason to be interested in the question of religion. And actually comes before the strongest evidence for the question, because you need a reason to pursue the conversation at all. And I grew up as an atheist in a pretty secular part of Long Island. So secular, in fact, you might ask how secular, so secular that in my AP European history class, when we covered the Protestant Reformation, a kid in my class raised their hand and went, "Do Lutherans still exist?" And this giant blonde crew cut guy had to go, "Yes, they do, I'm a Lutheran." We all went, "Really?" So I didn't know a lot of people who were religious personally until I went to college, and a lot of what I knew of religion was kind of rooted in American evangelical Protestantism, because that's the kind of religion that impinged on my life. That was the kind of religion that was informing political stances I didn't like, or weird fights over prayer in public schools or evolution in science classes, and it's what I paid attention to because I had a reason to be interested. They were messing things up. And when I went to college, I had a new reason to be interested. I joined this debating group at Yale University, and I found all these people who were really smart. Some of them were math majors, but a lot of whom were Catholic or Orthodox. And I thought this was weird. So that first thing that my friends did, give me a reason to be interested, was just that they were weird. And I enjoyed talking to them about how weird they were. And as I spoke to them, what I kind of, was most entranced by was my own ignorance. Because I noticed that I had all these clever rebuttals to American evangelical Protestantism, and when I threw them at my friends, they bounced off. And I found myself in the position of going all right, I'm pretty sure you're wrong, but I recognize I don't yet understand how to properly explain to you that you're wrong. And you're my friends now, and I care about you, so this is important to me. And because I was in a debating group saying, "You seem unbelievably wrong, let's have coffee," was a totally acceptable thing to do. And so I started actually reading more about Catholicism, mostly to better understand my wrong friends and explain to them why they were wrong. So that for me was kind of the first thing my friends did. They gave me a reason to be interested. Now, I will grant that this is not the conventional reason to be interested in a religion. There's a reason that Pope Francis talks a lot about just showing people your joy. That joy is kind of the natural opening for a conversation. That before you kind of pigeonhole someone and say, "Pardon me, would you like to hear Aquinas' proof for the existence of God?" You need a reason for them to want to sit through the conversation. And often, joy, beauty, all of those are kind of the first thing that attracts someone to that conversation, or even just a personal connection with you. I'm interested in this, I'd love to share it with you. I sat through that movie that you wanted me to watch because it mattered to you. This matters to me. What do you say? The first reason can be silly, but people need an initial reason to start the conversation. In my case, it was deep and abiding love for my wrong friends and puzzlement about how it was they could be so wrong. That's kind of the opening step. My friends really did three things for me, to help me along the road to conversion. And the second was that a lot of the time they kept their focus on the big questions. So what did I start talking about with my friends after I'd read Mere Christianity and after I read Orthodoxy and after I was arguing with them some more and reading Catholic bloggers? And we talked about the things you probably picture people talking about when you picture college students late at night with very cold pizza. What is truth? How do you know? If a trolley is coming down a track and there are two tracks and a variety of circumstances in play, which track should the trolley travel along according to a variety of different ethical schemas? Sorry, schematas. I don't want my mom to have to correct my grammar in front of a room. And a lot of times we kind of make fun of college students for this kind of attachment to abstraction, the silly playfulness with which people will follow things, sometimes what feels like past their logical conclusions. But I really appreciate it. It made an enormous difference for me. And I think it's a shame that we kind of most often think of that as a reasonable way to conduct a conversation, just for young people who are avoiding writing papers. Because what my friends and I were really interested in were high-stakes questions. If you want to live a moral life, how do you pursue that goal? And how do you check yourself when you start to err? Because Chesterton says, original sin is kind of the thing everyone concedes, even if they don't concede it in that language. That we have a tendency to know and love the good and fall short of it. And everyone agrees that's present and needs explanation. And once you kind of concede that point, for me, as like a nerdy statistician, I didn't see that as a problem of sin. I saw that as a problem of data and modeling, right? How can I know the world and know that I know it accurately enough to act? How can I look over my own actions and my own inclinations and trust myself to make good choices and be good to others? And so what I'd come in with really were, a fair number of highfalutin abstract principles that I was now defending to my friends and offering them in lieu of Catholicism, should they choose to partake. I had come into college as basically a moral realist, or as people put it sometimes in a more accusatory tone of voice, a Neoplatonist. And what that really just means is that I was pretty sure morality reflected a true fact about the world. That it was something we uncovered like archaeologists and not something we built like architects. Or more simply, in my mind, I thought morality was basically like math. It's something you study and observe truths about, and it's always been there and it will always be there, but we can engage it and pursue it and love it, and it shapes the way we understand the world. Arguably, the stakes are higher when it comes to morality than they are about math, and I usually believe that most of the time. I just like math an awful heck of a lot. So that was kind of the basic philosophical principle I was bringing to the table. And as for what morality looked like, I was a deontologist, and what that means basically is I made a lot of my moral choices thinking about where my duty lay, and thinking about what rules could be applied to everyone that I would endorse that I could follow. Immanuel Kant's kind of the best-known deontologist, and his most basic rule is you should always do what you would wish everyone else to do. You shouldn't take any action you couldn't ask everyone else to take, and so that means you can't lie. Because if other people lied, then lying itself, he says, would become meaningless, because lying only works if people aren't doing it all the time. It's a free rider problem, ethically. And so I came in with kind of all these moral systems, and I'm arguing with my friends. And where I really ran into trouble was kind of the question of where I was receiving all this knowledge of morality from. Which doesn't sound like a problem immediately. That's not usually the sticking point when people have ethical issues. If they gave me too much change, do I need to go back to the grocery store and return the change, or is it all right if I keep it? I have this ethical problem, and your friend doesn't turn back to you and go, how is it you come to know ethics? What is the source of your... most of the time, most of the decisions we're making, we're not jumping all the way back up to that highest level of questioning. What is the source of our knowledge of good and evil? But for me, this was important because it told me a lot about how I should check my usual intuitions, about where they were sourced. And I think it's also particularly important because it's a subject there actually isn't as much unanimity on as you might expect for such an important question, and one that hasn't had a lot of new data emerge about it in the last however many years. A lot of us don't spend a lot of time going, okay, thermostats exist, but how do thermostats come to exist? What is the nature of heat transfer? Because first of all, on a day-to-day basis, you don't need to know all the time. And people quite reasonably have a lot of trust in scientists and engineers to have worked out a reasonable way of pursuing the answers to those questions in a way that mostly works. There's relative consensus about the scientific method. But there isn't consensus today about kind of the parallel philosophical method. How do we check ethics? How do you know which ones are right? How do you know where they come from? And it makes it kind of all the more urgent to plunge into these weird abstract sounding questions because we have less reason to naively trust the experts because the experts mostly disagree with each other. including sense about whether the project is worthwhile at all. So that was the issue I really kept getting stuck on, this question of, where are my impulses or instincts about ethics coming from? I almost felt like I was in the position of someone who lived before we'd ever dissected an eyeball, right? If I went around saying, I have these impressions of a world around me with, color and light, but I don't know how I receive them. Well, I wouldn't at that period. I might be able to work out a few crude parts of the equation, like when I cover parts of my face, I don't see them anymore. I think somehow this thing I call seeing has something to do with this part of my face. And I felt like I was in that crude a spot with regard to ethics, which didn't give me a reason to kind of overthrow the idea that ethics existed and were real, any more than before we dissected the eye and knew a lot about optics, we had a reason to go, I don't understand this process. I'm going to proceed to live as though everything I see is completely untrustworthy or illusion. That would be both weird and almost immediately impractical, which I would contend is what happens if you try and live with like a severe doubt in ethics as a category. Similarly impractical, similarly dangerous. So I spent a lot of time with my friends on these large abstract questions and giving me the space to delve into those, having the enthusiasm to treat all my questions or bizarre assertions seriously, and this was really a benefit of being, 20-something, the stamina to stay up till 3 a.m. discussing these questions, to really dig into them in a way. It would be much harder in my life right now where I have to schedule things and wake up on time. Was all a blessing, this endless pursuit of truth and big questions, and the reason why we wanted to know the answer to what ultimately were smaller questions about religion. We cared about religion because we cared about truth and how the world works, and religion was something about how the world worked and how to live well. But the third thing I really have to thank my friends for is that although we had kind of a lot of fun on the abstract level, that we spent a lot of time talking kind of in more grounded terms as well. What really happened as the result of working out all these questions about religion within a debate society was that instead of just having fights about religion and just having fights about whence truth, I was also taking time to have fights about like what is the proper way to structure the education system in America, at what age should people be married, how much is what you do acting and how much is authenticity. That was a weirder one. The death penalty, yes, no, sometimes. Only when personally conducted by the victims. All these kind of what sound like policy questions, or questions of how to live at the scale of a human life, that my friends were answering through the lens of all their different philosophical commitments. So when I wanted to ask, like, what is Catholicism, or what is like crypto-anarchy, or what is like any of the other strange things my friends were trying to persuade me to believe, I didn't just have to answer that question in the abstract and divorced from all other context. I got to see what it meant at the scale of a human life to make these choices, where it led them. And what I could see, especially with my Catholic friends, I could kind of see the way that their faith ran as a thread through all these different arguments they were making, and to see how it informed their lives and the choices they were making. And that's where I started to have some of the problems that Chesterton talks about in his own conversion, where I'd find that some of his Catholicism had gotten to the right answer ahead of me, which was weird. It was like unusual and kind of cheating that a wrong philosophy often produced interesting right answers. And one thing I really prized about kind of being able to pursue these philosophical questions was almost as an error check, coming back to earth, looking at lived experience, looking at small-scale decisions, is that it is hard to kind of predict what will be the thing to change someone's mind. We can reason better about what we've actually lived and experienced. It's easier to almost have that sense of, wait a second, once you take a philosophy and bring it down to earth, it's easier to kind of recognize truth when it's making claims that you've actually observed, as opposed to claims about mythical trolleys on frictionless tracks. And for me, one of the things that was a big turning point was a really small ethical question. It wasn't a question of, if you were the last person on Earth, like, do you have an obligation to live through clones for the existence of the species? It wasn't anything like that, a weird hypothetical. One of the things that was a major turning point to me came out of like a very quotidian, very boring problem I was having. The problem I was having was, how long should speeches be allowed to be at our annual prize debate? Which is not, I think, what anyone would tell you to lead with as a question or a scenario to like help prompt your friends along the road to conversion. But I was dealing with the question of how long should speeches be? Different people in my debate groups disagreed. Did we want to give everyone the most time for their arguments? Did we not want to be there all night? And since the stakes were so low, you can imagine how vicious the fight got. And it was in the course of like what became a bizarrely baroque, week-long fight that I was, frustrated with one of the people who was particularly going after me in a very personal way. And I was talking to a Catholic friend of mine at the time, and I was asking him kind of about what he would be doing and what I was doing, because I was, a deontologist. Like, I was acting out of duty. My duty was not giving way to this person, not just because I was right on the merits of speaking time, but when I say not giving way, I mean responding to her with kindness. Not out of love for her, but out of love for goodness. And like my perspective really had been as a deontologist and as someone who really admired duty, really admired kind of pure, rigid adherence to rules, as someone who thought Javert was really a second hero of Les Miserables for his like steadfast commitment to his ethics. And I'm saying, well, what would you do? Because like I'm just trying to like aggressively not wrong this person. And I feel like it's working. And what my friend Chris said is like, well, like I would pray for Molly. Like, and I think you should, it said you don't believe in God. And I'm like, well, why would you pray for her? Isn't that just like complaining to God? Like, isn't that just going around saying like, hey God, like, I know that what I should do is be nice, but I'm too weak and lazy to do that. So like, please make my whole life easier so I don't have to be virtuous. Thanks. He's like, no, I would pray for Molly because it's not good for her to be this angry at you, Leah. Like, this is crazy. This has been like an entire week of crazy, and it's kind of, probably bad for Molly that she is this furious at you over a 1 minute difference in speaking times. And I said, like, why would I ask Molly to be different? Like, she can just like be angry. Like, what matters is me and my response. Like, that's the only part I control here. And what I kind of understood as we pursued this conversation is he was giving me a different, arguably less solipsistic or self-focused idea of how to approach ethics. Because he was kind of arguing that I shouldn't keep treating Molly's anger as intrinsic to her, as like an interesting obstacle I had to deal with, just like if it started raining when I don't have an umbrella. And he's saying that really Molly, like as a person, didn't deserve almost to be this angrier, like should be free of some of her anger and should live a fuller, happier life. Not because it makes my life easier and not because it would be like, smooth my way, but because it would be better for her. She'd be more herself. And I was thinking of being more herself as like being more of an obstacle to me, that was her main trait at this point. And this kind of is what shifted me over from deontology, that kind of rule-based morality, to virtue ethics, which is really focused on like, what are people supposed to be and how can they be most themselves? Where it kind of has snuck into a lot of the assumptions that most themselves looks a lot like being virtuous, rather than like most themselves means a lot like being aggressive, like red in truth and claw nature folk. But all that sounded true to me, and I read Alistair McIntyre, and I read a few other people, and this way of looking at the world and looking at ethics made more sense than the system I'd walked in with. Especially because it meant you could kind of progress towards a world where everyone was good. And the way I'd been thinking about deontology, like I could be the most virtuous, the worse everyone else was, because I would then be that much more patient in dealing with them. And I just didn't see as much opportunity for virtue if everyone else was already kind to me. But in virtue ethics, like it is actually a better world where everyone is kind and loving and takes joy in each other because they're all being most fully themselves and living their freest, happiest lives. And that was a change for me that came out of an argument about speaking times and like the inappropriate swear word someone used about me at a meeting. And so that's what I really mean about having the philosophical grounding that my friends gave me to ask these questions the right way, but the concrete, practical applications that let me test those philosophical ideas and really have my heart changed by a question no one really would have predicted, would be central to my movement towards God. So what my friends did is they gave me a reason to be curious, they helped me connect to the big questions, and they let me connect those questions back to the scale of the human life. And now comes the part where it gets, a little more personal, a little more specific. So for me, the actual final turning point was that I managed to wind up in a position after several years of arguments and a very large new theology section on my bookshelf, where I was like, all right, Catholicism isn't dumb. Big change. Catholicism, and what I meant by isn't dumb, was also that Catholicism doesn't refute itself. Like, it's not intrinsically contradictory. You can't kind of just walk in and go, okay, given everything you've told me about your religion, it does not go. And where I kind of felt about it was that it was like almost a parallel world, like Narnia or Harry Potter. It wasn't the world we happen to live in, but it held together as a world. And if it turned out I happened to live there, I wouldn't go, but causality and logic have fallen apart. But I would be surprised. And so that was Catholicism. And where I was at that point with my new virtue ethicist atheism was that, it also didn't have any flaws in it. I hadn't admitted anything into my worldview that wasn't true. But it didn't kind of hold together enough. It was patchy. It couldn't answer some of those questions about, okay, but how is it you come to know truth? Like, you're talking about this telos for people, and I saw where you stole that language from, Leah. It was totally from the Catholics. It was like, psh, useful language, it's fine, don't worry. But this telos, this end, this particular kind of person people are called to be, and where did that particular vision of humanity come from? Because it's not shaped, I can't just go like, oh, well, evolutionarily, altruism, something. Because evolution kind of just solves for the least it solves for like good enough to get by. Evolution is not a process that shapes us towards our best selves. It shapes us towards not dead yet. And so it wasn't really enough to tell me about where morality came from. And I kept struggling with this problem, but I didn't really want to give up on atheism on that basis for kind of the same reason I was saying earlier, where you wouldn't give up on vision just because you couldn't explain every piece of it. It makes sense often to hold things that are still patchy or a little contradictory, that you're still the most sure of, or that are your best model of the world, rather than leaping blind with nothing at all. You shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I was stuck. And I kind of needed something else to go any further. And what that was, unsurprisingly, was visiting my college debate group again, this time as an alumna. I was up for our winter banquet, and I just had this weird impression while I was at the debate, where if you'd been watching the debate, you didn't even know what religion was, but you were, like me, a statistician. And you were doing basically cluster analysis. You were looking at the room and trying to sort people into different groups just by listening to their speeches and what they talked about. It just seemed obvious that I was on the Catholic side of the room, even though we weren't debating religion. The way I was arguing and the things I appealed to and the kind of reasoning I was using all really sounded like one particular corner of the room. And I thought this was weird. And then after our debate, we went toasting, where we pass around a cup and make like slightly ridiculous speeches, and then drink to whatever we've toasted to. I had this sudden impulse to toast the Nicene Creed and convert to Christianity, like right there. I thought, like, that's very silly. For one, I don't think I know the Nicene Creed when everyone else isn't saying it at the same time. Number two, I think converting at toasting is more like aesthetically badass than it is like authentically Christian. And number three, I don't think I believe in God. I did come to that one last. So I didn't, but I was kind of confused, and I gave what must have been a very muddled toast because I was spending the whole time the cup was going around like trying to figure out where this impulse had come from. And then went back home. And then I came up in the spring for another alumni event, and I had the exact same problem, beat by beat. I went to the debate, I felt like I was on like the other side. This was a debate about like, should the curriculum be nationalized? It was not a debate about religion, but I was still having the sense of the kinship of my arguments and the kinship of what we were valuing and the way we were seeing the world. It was so weird. I didn't want to wait for the toasting session, so I grabbed a friend of mine who was Lutheran and said, look, whenever I go up to Yale, I have a weird impulse to convert to Catholicism. It's annoying. And he's like, well, do you want to talk about that? I'm like, yes, I would like to talk about that. So we skipped toasting. And I kind of walked him through everything I've just been walking you guys through, with fewer of the digressions about like how my friends were shaping this journey. And I ultimately left with that idea of like Catholicism as consistent, but not true. And my atheism as patchy, but not false. And he said basically, well, what are you going to do now? Like, how do you deal with your patchy bit? How do you deal with the problem